And that genetic relatedness helps to ease what normally would be a pretty intense jealous reaction to someone else sharing a sex partner, someone else having sex with your wife. And
so why isn't it sufficient to say, like the sort of more modern blank slate theorists might, that patriarchy is a sufficient explanation for the difference in mating strategies across the sexes, and that the reason that polyandry is so uncommon is because women are dominated by men everywhere, and that's arbitrary and an expression of power. It has nothing to do with our central biological tendency.
Okay, that's a really interesting question, and I have a couple of different thoughts on it. First of all, the first question is like, what does one mean by patriarchy? And if you get into it, and I've asked people who invoke those sort of explanations, well, what do you mean by patriarchy? And usually that causes them to stumble and mumble around. Well, and they just know, well, patriarchy, as though it's self-explanatory. Well, it's not self-explanatory because if you break it down analytically, you can identify different components. So is it the case that men worldwide tend to have more resources, more economic resources than women on average? Well, the answer is yes. But then even if you take that component of what's called patriarchy, you can ask the question, well, how did it come to pass that across all cultures, or nearly all cultures, men on average have more resources? Well, as one biological anthropologist, I think this was Irv DeVore at Harvard, he said men are one long breeding experiment run by women. Basically one of the things that one of my first studies, the 37 culture study, documented is that women have a universal preference for men with resources. And so that sets up a co-evolutionary process whereby those men who were chosen as mates tended to be motivated and have the ability and willingness to acquire resources and share.
So let me ask you about that specifically. This is a question that I tried to address experimentally at one point, but I couldn't get the experiments organized properly to test this specific hypothesis. Do you know of any research pitting female mate choice in relationship to men against men who have resources versus men who show the traits that allow them to acquire resources, pitting those directly against one another?
Yeah, great question. And I'm not aware of any studies that have done that directly.
See, I think that, and I want to talk to you about this in relationship to the dark triad issue, which we'll get into. It seems to me that women use markers of status partly as indicators of available resources because those are useful, but I don't think women are that uncanny, let's say. It's too simple. I think they use the presence of resources as a proxy for the personality and cognitive traits, let's say, including physical health, that would enable a man, even stripped of his current set of resources, to be highly likely to acquire them in the future. And maybe current resources are a good proxy for that.
Yeah, I think So one issue is that cash economies are relatively recent in our human history. I think maybe 7,000 to 10,000 years old or so. And so so we are able to stockpile economic resources in a way that is evolutionarily unprecedented due to cash economies. But I think that you're absolutely right that what women tend to look for, and shows up even in my studies as well, is the characteristics that are statistically reliably correlated with resource acquisition, which will be things like intelligence, social status, dependability, athletic prowess. Is this guy a good hunter? So you go to a culture like the Ache of Paraguay, and basically what leads to high status in men is hunting skills. That's like the big main effect there.